he sat in the witness chair. It was dark at 7 o'clock when Carl Lee Haley raised a window in the toilet and went quietly through the bushes and into the darkness. Getting the gun was no problem. Carl Lee and Lester just went to Memphis, met an old Army friend of Carl Lee's called Cat Brewster, and asked for an M16. 2 hours later, it was in the trunk of Lester's Cadillac. The gun was the easy part. What came next would be harder. On May 20th, Billy Ray Cobb and Pete Willard were brought back to the court to hear Judge Bullard tell them the date of their trial. Jake Briggins had no reason to be in court, but he still worried about Carl Lee as he worked in his office. Just before 2 o'clock, he went over to the window one more time and lit another cigarette. The two rapists had just heard that they would be held in the county jail until the trial. The crowd started to leave the courtroom, but Carl Lee's brother Lester did not move. He watched closely as the two white boys were taken through the door into the room behind the judge's table. When they were out of sight, he placed his head in his hands and said a short prayer. Then he listened. Cobb went first down the stairs, then Willard, then Deputy Looney. 10 steps down, then turn right, then 10 steps to the first floor. 3 other deputies waited outside by the police cars, smoking and watching the reporters who had come to the court. When Cobb reached the second step from the floor, with Willard 3 steps behind and Looney 1 step behind him, a small door burst open and Carl Lee Haley jumped out from the darkness with the M16 in his hands. Holding the gun only 1 or 2 feet from the men who had raped his daughter, he opened fire. The loud, rapid gunfire shook the courthouse and broke the silence. The rapists froze, then screamed as they were hit. Cobb first in the stomach and chest, then Willard in the face, neck, and throat. They tried to run back up the stairs, but fell over each other as they slipped on their own blood. Deputy Looney was hit in the leg, but managed to get up the stairs into a back room. From there, he could hear the screams of Cobb and Willard, and the crazy nigger laughing. Bullets continued to hit the walls of the narrow stairway, and as he looked through the door, Looney could see blood and flesh sliding down the walls. The enormous explosions of the M16 filled the courthouse. Through the gunfire and the sounds of the bullets hitting the walls of the stairway, Looney could still hear Carl Lee's crazy laughter. When Carl Lee stopped, he threw the gun at the 2 bodies and ran into the toilet. He went out through the window, as he had done on that earlier evening, onto the sidewalk. Then he walked to his pickup and drove home. Cobb, or what was left of him, stopped moving and lay against Willard. Their blood mixed and ran down each step, covering the foot of the stairway. Jake ran across the street to the back door of the courthouse. 1 deputy was on the floor, a gun in his hand, shouting at the reporters who were trying to get in. The other deputies looked out from behind the police cars. Jake ran to the front of the courthouse, where more deputies were guarding the door and getting people out of the building. Jake pushed his way through the crowd and inside. There, he found Ozzie Walls directing people and shouting instructions to his men. He called to Jake, and they walked down the hall to the back of the court, where a half-dozen deputies stood, guns in hand, looking silently at the stairway. Jake felt sick. The front of Willard's head was missing. Cobb had taken most of the bullets in his back. The thick smell of gunfire hung over the stairway. "Jake, you better leave," Ozzie said, without taking his eyes off the bodies. "Why?" "Just leave." "Why?" "Because we've got to take pictures and stuff, and you don't need to be here." "Okay. But you don't question him without me there. Understand?" Ozzy nodded. The only vehicles outside the Haley house were Gwen's car, Carl Lee's pickup, and the red Cadillac from Illinois. Ozzy expected no trouble as the police cars parked in a row across the front yard. The deputies bent down behind the open doors, watching as the sheriff walked alone to the house. He stopped. The front door opened slowly, and the Haley family came out. The two groups watched each other, each waiting for the other to say or do something, each wanting to avoid what had to happen. Ozzy kicked at some dirt on the path, looking at the family, then at his men. Finally, he said, "You'd better come with me." Carl Lee looked at the sheriff, but did not move. Gwen and the boy cried as Lester took the girl from her daddy. Then Carl Lee knelt in front of the three boys and whispered to them again that he must leave, but he wouldn't be gone long. He held them close, and they all cried and held on to him. He turned and kissed his wife, then walked down the steps to the sheriff. Chapter 3. Afterward. "You can see him in a minute, Jake," Ozzy said after Carl Lee had been brought back to the sheriff's office. "Thanks. You sure he did it?" "Yes, I'm sure." "He didn't say he did it." "No, he didn't say anything. I guess Lester told him what to do." Half an hour later, lawyer and client sat across the table and looked at each other carefully. They smiled, but neither spoke. They had last talked 5 days before, the day after the rape. Carl Lee was not as troubled now. His face was relaxed and his eyes were clear. Finally, he said, "You didn't think I'd do it, Jake." "Not really. You did do it." "You know I did." Jake smiled, nodded, and crossed his arms. "How do you feel?" Carl Lee sat back in the folding chair. "Well, I feel better. I don't feel good about the whole thing. But then, I don't feel good about what happened to my girl, you know." "Are you scared?" "Of what?" "How about the electric chair?" "No, Jake. That's why I've got you. I don't plan to go to the chair. You helped Lester. Now you can do it for me, Jake." "It's not quite that easy, Carl Lee. You just don't shoot a person, or two people, tell the jury they needed to be killed, and expect to walk out of the courtroom." "You did with Lester." "But every case is different. And the big difference here is that you killed two white boys and Lester killed a nigger. Big difference." "You scared, Jake?" "Why should I be scared? I'm not facing the electric chair." "You don't sound too confident." "You big, stupid fool," thought Jake. How could he be confident at a time like this? Sure, he was confident before the killings, but now it was different. His client was facing the electric chair for a crime which everyone knew he did. And that was only the beginning of his problems. Carl Lee was a black who had killed two whites in a mainly white county. Rufus Buckley would be the prosecutor, and Rufus would do everything he could to win. It was personal between him and Jake. and there was going to be a problem about money. Jake hated to discuss professional costs, but he knew he had to do it immediately. Clients wanted to know about his charges, and most were shocked at how expensive the law could be. After he had talked about Carl Lee's family and how they were, Jake started to talk about preparing for the trial. Carl Lee made it easy for him and asked how much all of that was going to cost. Jake looked at the file and the contract he had brought with him and thought desperately of a fair amount. There were other lawyers out there who would take such a case for almost nothing. Nothing except publicity. He thought about the land Carl Lee owned, the job at the paper factory, and his family, and finally said, $10,000. Carl Lee did not seem too worried, though he said, "You charged Lester $5,000. They finally agreed on $7,500. After Jake filled out the contract and Carl Lee signed, Carl Lee asked, "Jake, how much would you charge a man with plenty of money?" $50,000. $50,000? Are you serious? Yes. Man, that's a lot of money. Did you ever get that much? No, but I haven't seen too many people on trial for murder with that kind of money. Once he had finished talking with his client, Jake left the sheriff's office and walked toward the reporters with their microphones and cameras. Although he pretended he wanted to get away from them, he stopped for enough time to stand in front of the cameras and answer 10 or more questions. Ozzie and the deputies watched from inside. "Jake loves cameras," the sheriff said. "All lawyers do," added one of the deputies. After a cold supper, Jake and his wife sat at the front of their house and looked out at the garden. They talked about the case. Jake's interview was too late for the early evening news, so he and Carla waited for the 10 o'clock program. And there he was, looking fit and handsome. Jake thought he looked great on TV, and he was excited to be there. He felt good. He enjoyed the publicity. And when Carl Lee Haley was found not guilty of the murder of the 2 white men who raped his daughter before an all-white jury in rural Mississippi... "What are you smiling about?" asked Carla. "Nothing." "Sure. You're thinking about the trial and the cameras and the reporters and walking out of the courthouse with Carl Lee a free man. Reporters chasing you with the TV cameras, everyone congratulating you. I know exactly what you're thinking about." "Then why did you ask?" "To see if you'd admit it." "Okay, I admit it. This case could make me famous and make us $1 million. If you win." Next morning, Tuesday, Jake ate his usual breakfast at the coffee shop. He noticed that some of the regular customers were quieter with him than normal, but he hoped this would change when Deputy Looney was out of hospital. Looney was well liked by the other customers, and Jake knew that there were some who would not be happy about him defending Carl Lee. He spent the rest of the morning making arrangements for the trial and talking to a TV reporter from Memphis. He went home feeling a lot happier. On Wednesday, at 10 a.m., the 2 rapists were buried. The minister struggled desperately for something comforting to say to the small crowd. The service was short and with few tears. Afterward, friends came to the Cobb's house. The men sat around in the backyard while the women looked after Mrs. Cobb. The men drank whiskey and talked about the good times when niggers knew their place. Then one cousin said he knew someone who used to be active in the Ku Klux Klan, and he might give him a call. Cobb's grandfather had been in the Klan, the cousin explained, and when he and Billy Ray were children, the old man told stories about hanging niggers in Ford and Tyler counties. They should do the same thing the nigger had done. Maybe the Klan would be interested. In the courtroom, the groups of blacks and whites sat opposite each other and watched the machinery of justice at work. Ozzie Walls was the first witness. He gave a clear report of what had happened when Cobb and Willard were killed and what had happened after. He talked about the shooting, the bodies, the wounds, the gun, the fingerprints on the gun, and the fingerprints of the defendant. Other witnesses followed and told how they had seen Carl Lee shoot the two men and walk out of the courthouse. It was clear that he had killed the men who raped his daughter, and Jake did not ask any questions. Carl Lee was handed to the sheriff to be held until the trial, and everyone left the courtroom. Jake got ready to talk to the reporters who had already started to crowd around the courtroom doors. Later on Wednesday night, the doctors had to remove Looney's leg below the knee. They called Ozzie at the jail, and he told Carl Lee. Rufus Buckley looked through the Thursday morning papers and read with great interest the report of the previous day's events in Ford County. He was delighted to see his name mentioned by the reporters and by Mr. Briggins. He didn't like Briggins, but he was glad Jake used his name in front of the cameras and reporters. For 2 days, Briggins and Carl Lee had had all the publicity. It was time the prosecutor was mentioned. Rufus Buckley was 41 and very ambitious. He wanted a big public position, maybe even governor. He had it all planned, but he was not well known outside the district. He needed to be seen and heard. He needed publicity. Rufus needed, more than anything else, to win a big, nasty, well-publicized murder trial. On the same Thursday morning, Jake was reading the same newspaper. He was interrupted by his secretary, Ethel, who came and stood in front of the big desk.
"Mr. Briggins, my husband and I received a threatening phone call last night, and I've just had the second one here at the office. I don't like this."
Jake pointed to a chair. "Sit down, Ethel. What did these people say?"
"They threatened me because I work for you. Said I'd be sorry because I worked for a nigger lover. They threatened to harm you and your family, too. I'm just scared."
Jake was worried, too, but did not show it to Ethel. He had called Ozzie on Wednesday and reported the calls to his own house. He advised her to change her number, but she did not want to do that. She wanted him to stop defending Carl Lee. Jake refused, and the conversation ended, like so many conversations he had with Ethel, in disagreement. An hour later, Ethel called him to say that Lucien, the man who had given Jake the law business, had asked Jake to come to his house with some recent cases. Lucien came to the office or called once a month. He read cases and kept up to date with developments in the law. He had little else to do except drink his whiskey.